I never expected my friend's mom to lean on my shoulder, and stay there. What happened next changed everything between us. I had only planned to drop by my friend's house for a quick afternoon visit. It was the kind of casual thing where nothing is expected, but somehow, even in the first few minutes, I could feel that something about today would be different. The sun streamed through the living room window, casting golden patterns across the floor, and there she was, my friend's mom, sitting in the armchair by the window, completely absorbed in a book. She was beautiful in a way that was effortless, graceful, and understated. Not in the flashy way magazines advertise, but in the kind of presence that quietly fills a room without demanding attention. Her hair caught the sunlight in soft waves, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered, delicate but comforting. I felt a strange pull, a curious awareness that I wasn't expecting. "Hey, I'm here," I called lightly, trying to sound casual. She looked up from her book, her eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second longer than normal, and I noticed the warmth in her gaze. It wasn't flirtatious, at least not in a way that was obvious, but it carried a quiet steadiness that made me feel unusually seen. As I stepped into the living room, my friend waved at me from the kitchen. I was about to walk over when she set her book down. "I made some tea," she said, her voice soft but calm. There was a natural warmth in the way she spoke, a comforting kind of ease. She stood and handed me a steaming cup. Our fingers brushed lightly as I accepted it, and I felt a small, electric jolt, a brief but undeniable connection. We exchanged a few words about the weather, the book she was reading, and some trivial household chatter, but every word was layered with subtle observation. I found myself noticing things I never would have before, the tilt of her head when she smiled, the way her eyes lingered on me just a fraction too long, the smooth way she moved as she returned to her chair. I realized I was paying attention not because I meant to, but because I wanted to. Sitting across from her, I felt an unfamiliar calm wash over me. There was something in her quiet presence that made the room feel warmer, softer. Even the ordinary, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, felt like it had a rhythm that matched this strange, gentle tension between us. I couldn't tell if she was aware of it, but I didn't mind. By the time my friend returned from the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, I had already caught myself stealing glances at her. Not in a casual way, but in the way you notice a moment before it becomes something you can't ignore. A soft curiosity, a quietly growing fascination, had begun to take root, and I knew, almost instinctively, that this afternoon would linger in my mind long after I left. Even in this first encounter, nothing had happened. No words of confession, no bold gestures. Yet somehow, in a room filled with sunlight and quiet conversation, the smallest touch, the briefest glance, and the steady calm of her presence had planted the first seed of something neither of us could yet name. The living room smelled faintly of the tea she had poured earlier, warm and slightly sweet. I had settled onto the armchair across from the couch where she was now sitting, and for a while, neither of us said much. The television played in the background, low and almost irrelevant, as if it were merely a hum to fill the comfortable silence. She shifted slightly, tucking one leg beneath her, and I noticed the subtle curve of her posture, the ease with which she seemed to inhabit the space. I tried to focus on the movie, but my attention kept drifting back to her, the way her fingers brushed the fabric of her dress absent-mindedly, the small tilt of her head whenever she reacted to something on the screen, the quiet grace in her movements. At one point, she laughed softly at a line in the movie, and the sound was warm, almost musical. I realized that I had unconsciously leaned forward a little, trying to be closer, not in a deliberate way, but in the same instinctive way one moves towards something comforting. She glanced at me briefly, and our eyes met, and in that moment, there was a pause. Nothing was said, but I felt the subtle electricity of awareness, of two people noticing each other more fully than they normally would. She adjusted herself, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and her shoulder lightly brushed against mine as she shifted. The contact was brief, accidental in appearance, but it left a surprising warmth in its wake. I could feel my heartbeat quicken slightly, not in fear, but in a heightened attentiveness, as if my entire being had suddenly tuned into her presence. The room felt smaller, warmer, and somehow more intimate. Even the mundane, the soft hum of the air conditioner, the distant sound of a car outside, seemed to blend into a kind of background music for this small, shared moment. She leaned back against the couch, her gaze occasionally flicking to me with a gentle curiosity, and I realized I was doing the same. Neither of us spoke much, yet the quiet conversation of glances, shifts in posture, and the subtle brushing of hands was speaking volumes. There was an odd comfort in the closeness. I was aware of her scent, a delicate mix of soap and something faintly floral, and it was grounding in a way I hadn't expected. I tried to remind myself that this was normal, just a visit, just watching a movie, but every small movement, every lingering glance, carried a tension that I couldn't quite name. For the first time, I noticed her laugh lingering in the air long after the sound had faded, her subtle smiles that seemed meant for no one in particular yet somehow landed on me. I felt the pull of wanting to be near her, not for any overt reason, but simply to share the warmth, the quiet presence, and the unspoken understanding that had begun to form between us. By the end of the movie, I realized that what had started as casual proximity had become something more, a gentle, slow awareness that perhaps this ordinary afternoon was quietly setting the stage for a connection neither of us had expected, a bond built from small touches, lingering glances, and the subtle intimacy of being near someone who sees you in a way that feels quietly profound. Later that evening, after my friend had left to run an errand, it was just the two of us in the living room. The house had grown quieter, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards filling the small spaces between words. She was curled on the couch, a soft blanket draped over her legs, and I sat nearby on the armchair, still holding the mug of tea she had poured for me earlier. For a while, we simply watched the muted city lights flicker through the window, neither of us speaking. Then, almost without warning, she let out a small sigh, as if carrying something unspoken for far too long. "It's been a strange week," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. I looked at her, noticing the faint crease between her brows, the way her hand unconsciously rubbed at her temple. There was a vulnerability in her posture that made her seem smaller, more human in a way that contrasted sharply with the confident, graceful woman I had seen earlier. Without thinking, I shifted closer. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked gently. Her eyes met mine for a moment, and in them, I saw hesitation, uncertainty about whether it was appropriate to lean on someone so much younger, someone outside the family. And yet, there was a quiet trust in her glance, a willingness to take the risk of being seen fully. She nodded slightly, and without another word, she leaned her head on my shoulder. It was brief at first, tentative, as if testing boundaries. The softness of her hair against my neck, the warmth of her cheek, the faint scent of her perfume, everything combined to create a strange sense of calm. I felt my body respond naturally, not in desire, but in protective instinct, a need to offer comfort. I didn't move, didn't speak. I simply let her presence settle against me, feeling the subtle rise and fall of her breath. She murmured quietly about her week, small frustrations and unspoken worries that she had never shared with anyone else. Her words were measured, but the honesty in them made the room feel heavier, yet lighter at the same time, as if confiding was a release. I listened, responding with soft nods, short phrases of understanding, letting her know she was not alone. At one point, her hand brushed mine as she gestured while speaking. It lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I could feel the warmth of her skin through the fabric of the blanket. I resisted the urge to pull away, instead allowing the touch to feel natural, an extension of the trust she had placed in me. When she finally lifted her head, she looked at me with a quiet vulnerability that left me momentarily breathless. "Thank you," she whispered, and there was a depth to that simple phrase that carried more than gratitude. It was relief, acknowledgement, and perhaps a small spark of connection. In that moment, I realized that intimacy wasn't about bold gestures or dramatic declarations. It was in the shared silence, the leaning into trust, the subtle touches that spoke louder than words ever could. And somehow, just somehow, I understood that the foundation for something profound had begun to form between us, delicate, cautious, but undeniable. The next afternoon, rain had begun tapping gently against the window, turning the world outside into a soft blur of gray and muted colors. Inside, the living room felt cozy in contrast, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the warmth of the blankets she had draped over the couch. I had arrived for a short visit, expecting nothing more than casual conversation, yet somehow the atmosphere already felt charged with quiet tension. She was sitting cross-legged on the couch, a cup of tea in her hands, and the soft light from the overcast sky highlighted the graceful lines of her face. I chose the armchair beside her, but closer than usual, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't quite explain. The distance between us seemed smaller, not just in space but in something deeper, a shared awareness of the unspoken feeling simmering beneath the surface. We talked quietly at first, about trivial things, the sound of rain, a show she had been watching, small anecdotes from her week. But each word carried weight in the silence between us. Occasionally, her knee brushed mine as she shifted slightly, or her hand lingered on the mug as if reluctant to let go. Every accidental touch felt deliberate, a gentle probe of boundaries, and I felt my pulse quicken with the awareness of her presence so close to mine. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned her head against my shoulder. It was so natural, so unforced, that I almost questioned whether it was my imagination. Her hair brushed my neck, soft and warm, and I felt the steady rhythm of her breathing. My own body responded instinctively, an unspoken protective comfort that rooted me in the moment. I didn't move, didn't speak, I simply let her be there, feeling the weight of the connection deepen. Minutes passed like this, uncounted but significant, each one stretching the fragile intimacy between us. Occasionally, she shifted, nuzzling slightly closer, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her cheek. The sound of rain became background music to our quiet closeness, the gentle patter against the window echoing the pulse of a moment that was more than friendship, but still restrained by hesitation. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft and almost shy. I don't know why I'm so comfortable with you, she admitted, and there was no trace of irony, only honesty. I replied simply, keeping my tone gentle, it's okay. You can be. There was a pause, filled with the subtle intimacy of shared trust, before she nestled her head slightly more firmly against me, as if accepting the comfort and safety of my presence. I became acutely aware of the warmth of her shoulder beneath my hand, the softness of her hair, the calm steadiness of her breathing. Each sensation was magnified by the slow, unspoken acknowledgement that this closeness was building something profound. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't urgent, yet the emotional tension simmered in the space between us, subtle but undeniable. By the time the rain eased, the room was quiet except for the faint drip of water from the eaves. She finally lifted her head, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, and offered a small, tentative smile. In that brief, luminous moment, I knew something significant had shifted, a bond had formed through mere presence, gentle touches, and lingering proximity, setting the stage for feelings that neither of us could ignore. The drive home was quiet, but my mind was anything but. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the fading afternoon light, yet all I could see were the images of her leaning on my shoulder, the soft warmth of her presence lingering long after I had left. Every small gesture, every fleeting glance replayed itself in my mind as if the world around me had faded and left only that moment. I couldn't shake the feeling of conflict that had begun to settle in my chest. Part of me felt elated, there was a strange, intoxicating comfort in the intimacy we had shared, in the trust she had placed in me. But another part was uneasy, questioning the appropriateness of my thoughts. She was my friend's mother, older, and yet, somehow, she had made herself a part of my quiet inner world, and I couldn't help but notice it. At home, I sat in my room, staring at the faint streaks of sunlight spilling through the curtains. My hands unconsciously traced the edge of my desk, the same way my fingers had traced the edge of the blanket where she had rested her head. It was a small, almost imperceptible echo of her touch, yet it sent a shiver of warmth through me. I realized that the moment had lingered far longer in my mind than it had in reality, and the awareness unsettled me more than I expected. A text message from her blinked on my phone, "Thanks for earlier," it meant a lot. I stared at it, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to say something that might reveal my own feelings, my own longing for that quiet closeness. But another part hesitated, aware of boundaries and the delicate nature of what had just begun. I typed, erased, and typed again before finally sending a simple, safe reply, "I'm glad. Anytime." Even then, my thoughts refused to settle. I kept replaying her small gestures, the way her hair brushed my neck, the warmth of her cheek, the way she had closed her eyes as if trusting me completely. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, a subtle emotional tether that had been formed in those moments of quiet vulnerability. I realized that it wasn't just curiosity or fleeting attraction, it was the beginning of a connection that felt unexplainably significant. I also recognized the inner tug-of-war I was experiencing. Part of me wanted to explore it further, to lean into the warmth and comfort that she offered. Yet, a deeper voice reminded me of the social implications, the age gap, and the delicate balance between friendship, admiration, and something more. Every heartbeat seemed to echo that tension, desire tempered by hesitation, affection shadowed by uncertainty. By the time night fell, I found myself staring at the ceiling, reflecting on how a simple afternoon visit had turned into an emotional labyrinth. I realized that she had left an imprint on me, not just in memory, but in the way my thoughts, my awareness, and even my emotions had shifted. The conflict wasn't a barrier, it was a sign that something profound had begun. And yet, I knew that the next step wouldn't be about rushing toward confession or declaration. It would be about patience, about understanding the slow pull of emotions, and about navigating the delicate balance between intimacy, trust, and propriety. Somehow, in the quiet aftermath of her touch and her presence, I understood that what was beginning between us was far from ordinary, and it was worth feeling, even with the uncertainty it brought. The following weekend, she appeared at the door unexpectedly, holding a small tray with freshly baked cookies. The afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, warming the living room in muted gold tones. I invited her in, and we settled into the familiar arrangement, her on the couch, me on the armchair beside her, the air thick with a quiet anticipation neither of us had yet fully acknowledged. We began with casual conversation, but there was a noticeable shift in the energy. Our words carried a gentleness, a heightened awareness of each other. Every glance seemed deliberate, every pause more meaningful. When she handed me a cookie, our fingers brushed lightly, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The warmth of her hand lingered against mine, a subtle confirmation of the connection that had been quietly growing between us. She leaned back against the couch, and this time, her head found my shoulder almost instinctively. Unlike before, there was no hesitation, no testing of boundaries. She rested there with a calm acceptance, and I could feel the warmth of her cheek against my neck, her breath soft and steady. I placed my arm gently behind her, letting her weight shift naturally, creating a quiet, unspoken intimacy that neither of us needed to label. The conversation slowed, evolving into something deeper. She shared fragments of her thoughts, small confessions about her day-to-day worries, and memories that carried a weight she rarely spoke aloud. I listened, offering soft responses and occasional laughter where appropriate, but mostly I remained a steady presence, quiet, attentive, grounding. She tilted her head, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and I felt the subtle pull of desire tempered by the need for patience. At one point, she looked up at me, her eyes holding a mixture of curiosity, gratitude, and something more vulnerable. "I feel like I can really be myself with you," she admitted softly. Her words hung between us, charged with an emotional honesty that made my chest tighten. I nodded slowly, my heart echoing the sentiment. "I feel the same," I whispered, careful not to let my voice carry more than the weight of sincerity. The silence that followed was rich and comforting, filled with the sound of our steady breathing, the soft ticking of the clock, and the faint hum of distant traffic outside. She leaned a little closer, her hand brushing against mine on the blanket that covered both our laps. The touch was deliberate but gentle, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken connection we had nurtured over weeks of subtle proximity, shared moments, and lingering glances. By the time she finally lifted her head, the tension between us had shifted, not diminished, but transformed into a warm, mutual recognition of feelings. We didn't need to speak of desire, boundaries, or consequences. The intimacy was present in the quiet, in the lingering touches, in the unhurried trust we were allowing to grow. As she prepared to leave, I felt a sense of completeness, a calm satisfaction that contrasted with the earlier uncertainty and conflict. For the first time, it felt possible that this slow, delicate connection could evolve naturally, built on honesty, trust, and quiet affection. It wasn't about rushing forward, it was about acknowledging the depth of what had begun and letting it unfold in its own time, a beautiful, unspoken promise between us. By the next weekend, the pace of our meetings had settled into a quiet rhythm, each visit carrying the weight of growing familiarity and unspoken connection. This afternoon, the living room was bathed in the soft glow of the late sun, the golden light falling across the couch where she was already seated, a book resting loosely in her lap. I came in with a mug of tea, and she looked up with a smile that made the room feel warmer than the sunlight itself. We didn't speak immediately, simply enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. There was no need for words, the silence was filled with a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the emotional bond that had formed between us. She shifted slightly, letting the blanket that covered her lap drape across my legs as well. The simple touch of the fabric felt intimate, almost protective, a silent invitation to be close without overt pressure. As we sipped our tea, the conversation naturally turned to memories, small stories from her past, and reflections on the little moments that shaped our lives. She laughed softly at a story, and I felt her gaze linger on me, warm and steady. In that look, I recognized the depth of trust and affection she had come to feel, and it mirrored my own. We leaned in slightly, shoulders brushing, not out of urgency but out of a mutual desire for closeness. Eventually, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder, this time without hesitation or testing. The motion felt entirely natural, like two familiar notes harmonizing effortlessly. I adjusted slightly to make her comfortable, feeling the subtle warmth of her cheek and the gentle rhythm of her breathing. There was no rush, no need to speak or define the moment, it was enough to simply be near each other, allowing the silence to carry the intimacy between us. Her hand found mine atop the blanket, a soft, lingering touch that said more than words ever could. I held it loosely, careful not to move too soon, letting the connection deepen in its own time. It was a warmth that spoke of trust, mutual respect, and a growing sense of belonging. Each gesture, each glance, carried layers of emotion, gratitude, admiration, and a quiet romantic pull that had been building slowly, patiently, across the days and weeks. As the sun dipped lower, painting the room in shades of amber and rose, we shared a few more soft words, gentle laughter, and comfortable silences. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden declaration. Instead, there was a steady, abiding warmth, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. Our proximity, the subtle touches, the way our hands and shoulders connected, these small details conveyed everything that needed to be said. By the time she rose to leave, we were both aware that something profound had formed between us. She smiled, her eyes holding a quiet promise, and I returned it, feeling a deep, unspoken understanding. We didn't need to rush forward or define the connection, it was already significant, grounded in trust, affection, and a slow-burning intimacy that only time and patience could create. As I watched her leave, the blanket still draped across my legs, I realized that this was the resolution we had both been building toward, not a dramatic finale, but a gentle, enduring closeness that would continue to grow. It was the kind of warmth that stays with you, long after the sun has set and the room has quieted, a testament to the beauty of connection, patience, and love that unfolds naturally. If you enjoyed this slow-burn story of unexpected connection and quiet romance, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our heartwarming tales. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt a moment like this, where a simple gesture changed everything?